In Appalachian gardens, a handful of saved seed could carry more than next year's crop. It carried memory, independence, and a way of living through hard times. I want to walk you through that today. Not the seed catalog kind of gardening, but the old household kind, where a woman shelled beans onto a newspaper on the kitchen table in October and knew exactly which ones were going back in the ground come May. I'll tell you how families chose what to keep, how they dried it and stored it and traded it, what the bean varieties meant to a mountain family, and why a jar of seed sitting on a shelf was worth more to some folks than money in a bank that might close on them. Stay with me. By the end, you'll understand what a garden meant in these mountains and why the old folks guarded it the way they did. You have to understand the arrangement first. Through the late 1800s and well into the 1900s, a lot of families in the southern mountains, in eastern Kentucky, southwest Virginia, East Tennessee, western North Carolina, and all through West Virginia, lived on land that was steep, thin, and a long way from a store. Cash money came in seasons. Timber work, a coal camp payroll, a little tobacco, some ginseng or galax dug in the fall. But food came out of the ground behind the house, and it came out of the ground every year, whether the payroll came or not. So the garden was not a hobby. It was the household's insurance. A family might plant corn on a hillside so steep you had to lean into it to hoe, and around that corn they'd run beans up the stalks, and between the rows they'd set pumpkins and squash. 3 crops in one patch of dirt. That's not a quaint idea. That's a family doing arithmetic with the only ground they had. And every one of those crops came from seed somebody in that house had kept from the year before. Here's the part that folks who buy their seed in a paper packet never had to think about. If you save your own, then every fall you are making a decision that your family lives with for the next 12 months. You didn't save the whole row. You walked the patch and you picked the bean vine that held on through a dry August, the tomato that came in first, because come September in these mountains, first matters, the corn ear that filled all the way out to the tip instead of quitting an inch short. The old folks called it saving from the best, and what they were really doing, a generation at a time, was fitting a crop to one particular hillside. Your beans got used to your ground, your rainfall, your frost date. A seed saved on the same place for 40 years is a different animal than what you order out of a catalog because it has been answering the same questions for 40 years. That's why a woman would be careful about it. Give away a mess of beans to eat, sure, gladly. But the seed beans, the ones drying in a poke behind the stove, those were the family's 40 years of answers. If there's one crop that carries this whole story, it's beans. The mountain south held an astonishing number of bean varieties, and the reason is simple enough. Beans mostly keep to themselves when they flower, so what you plant this year comes back pretty true next year. A family could hold a bean steady across generations without any special knowledge of how it worked. They just knew that it worked. So the names piled up. Greasy beans, called that because the pod is smooth and shiny with no fuzz on it, so it catches the light like it's been rubbed with lard. Cutshorts, where the seeds crowd each other so tight in the pod that they square off at the ends and get cut short. Half runners, that vine, some but not all the way. Fall beans, October beans, cornfield beans that were bred without anybody calling it breeding, to climb a cornstalk without dragging it down. And then the names that were really addresses. A bean called for the family that kept it, or the creek it came from, or the woman who handed it across a fence. Somebody's name attached to a living thing that was still coming up out of the ground 80 years after they were buried. That's the part I want you to sit with. A packet of seed is a product. A named bean is a record. Saving seed was only half of it. The other half was putting up what you weren't saving, because a garden gives you everything in about 6 weeks and then quits. The oldest method in these mountains, older than the canning jar, was drying. Green beans strung on a stout thread with a needle, hung in long loops from a rafter or across the porch and left to shrivel down until they looked like an old man's pants. Leather britches, they called them. Shut beans, some places. Come February, you'd break off a length, soak it overnight, and cook it with a piece of meat until the kitchen smelled like August. Apples went the same road. Quartered and laid out on a clean board or a tin roof in the sun, turned over, brought in at night so the dew wouldn't set them back until they went leathery and sweet. Those became stack cake apples, and a stack cake at a mountain wedding was 6 or 8 thin layers with dried apple filling between them, and each layer might come from a different neighbor's kitchen. Then came the jars. Home canning spread through mountain households in the early 1900s, and it changed the winter, plainly and permanently. Corn, beans, tomatoes, kraut in a crock weighted with a creek rock and a plate. Potatoes and cabbage and turnips buried in a straw-lined hole with dirt mounded over it, a root cellar dug into the bank behind the house where the temperature never much moved. And under it all, the seed. Dry, cool, dark, and up off the floor where the mice couldn't get to it. Now, how did a bean get from one holler to another? Not through a store, through people. Seed moved at church, folded in a scrap of paper, and passed on a Sunday. It moved at a funeral, of all places, because that's where the whole family showed up. It moved when a daughter married and went over the ridge, and her mother sent her off with the beans she'd grown up eating, so the new kitchen would smell like the old one. It moved when somebody's crop failed and a neighbor made it right without a word about paying it back. It moved in the mail, too. There are families who kept seed alive across a whole migration, mountain people who went north to Detroit or Cincinnati or Dayton for factory work in the 1940s and 50s. And every spring, somebody back home would put a few beans in an envelope and send them up. A garden plot behind a city house, growing the same bean that grew on a Kentucky hillside. And it moved through hard times most of all. Through the 1930s, through mine shutdowns and strikes and bad years, the garden did what a wage couldn't. You could lose the job. You could lose the store credit. The seed was already in the jar. I'll be honest with you about the other side of it because it's part of the story. After the Second World War, a lot of this thinned out. Young people left. Grocery stores got close and got cheap. A hybrid seed out of a catalog would out-yield the home bean in a good year, and folks are practical, so plenty of families let their old varieties go. When somebody dies without handing the jar to anybody, that's the end of it. No ceremony. Just an empty row where a bean used to be. But a good deal of it held on. Held on in kitchens where an old woman kept planting the same beans because they were the ones she liked and never thought of herself as preserving anything. Held on in seed swaps at county fairs and church basements and community centers where people show up in March with baby food jars and coffee cans and trade across a folding table. And starting in the last few decades, seed savers and heirloom collectors across Appalachia went hunting for the old varieties on purpose, knocking on doors, writing down where a bean came from and who kept it, getting a name back on a seed that had nearly gone anonymous. Some of those beans are growing today because one person had a coffee can in a cool back room and somebody thought to ask. So here's what I promised you at the start, laid out plain. A handful of saved seed carried next year's crop, and that was the least of it. It carried memory, because the bean had a name, and the name was a person. It carried independence, because a family that saved its own seed did not have to ask anybody's permission to eat. And it carried a way of living through hard times, because when the payroll stopped and the credit dried up, the garden did not care. The seed was in the jar on the shelf, dry and cool, and waiting on May. That's why the old folks were particular about it. Not secrecy. Stewardship. You were holding something that a whole line of people had worked on before you, and you were expected to hand it along in better shape than you got it, or at least in the same shape. If your people kept a bean or a tomato or a corn, I'd count it a kindness if you tell me the name of it down below. Names are the part that goes first. I'm Silas. Take care of your own.